February 17, 1943, Luftwaffe Forward Air Base, Morozovsk. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood before 37 assembled German pilots in the briefing room, cigarette smoke curling toward rafters, still shaking from overnight harassment raids. For the fourth consecutive night, his men had endured interrupted sleep, sporadic explosions at fuel depots 3 kilometers west, and the psychologically wearing sound of engines cutting in and out above their positions. The base quartermaster had reported unexplained losses of ammunition stores totaling 18 tons in 72 hours. Weber, a veteran of the Battle of Britain with 19 confirmed kills, called this emergency briefing to address what German intelligence dismissively termed the Nachthexen problem. "Gentlemen, our eastern adversaries have deployed their latest desperation measure," Weber announced, unfolding a captured Soviet document detailing the 588th Night Bomber Regiment's composition. Women, flying crop dusters, wooden biplanes designed in 1928, before most of these girls were born. Laughter rippled through the assembled officers. Oberleutnant Hans Krieger raised his schnapps glass in mock toast. "Perhaps we should send our farm boys with pitchforks instead of Messerschmitts, Herr Hauptmann." More laughter. "Their aircraft maximum speed is 94 miles per hour. Weber continued, voice dripping with professional contempt. "Our Bf-109s cruise at twice that. They carry no radios, no parachutes, no defensive armament. Canvas and plywood construction. One incendiary round and they burn like kindling." The room erupted in confident predictions of swift German victory, officers calculating how many Iron Crosses would be distributed once these primitive relics were swept from Soviet skies within the month. What Hauptmann Weber didn't know was that at that precise moment, 23-year-old Junior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova was already airborne 70 kilometers northeast, her Polikarpov Po-2 loaded with 200 kilograms of fragmentation bombs. This was her 208th mission of what would eventually become 852, a number so staggering that German intelligence officers would later refuse to believe it, dismissing Soviet records as propaganda. Popova, a Ukrainian pilot whose family home had been converted into a Gestapo headquarters, and whose brother had been killed in the Nazi invasion's opening weeks, had joined Marina Raskova's experimental female aviation regiment in October 1941. By February 1943, she had already dropped over 60 tons of bombs on German positions, survived 3 forced landings, and once returned to base with her aircraft so damaged that ground crews counted 42 bullet holes in the fuselage, wings, her navigation map, and impossibly, her leather helmet. 48 hours after Weber's confident briefing, his base's primary ammunition depot erupted in a series of explosions, visible from 15 kilometers away, destroying 60,000 artillery rounds and 17 tons of small arms ammunition. The raid was conducted by 3 Po-2s. One was piloted by Nadezhda Popova. German night air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939 through brutal lessons learned over Britain and refined across the Eastern Front, represented the pinnacle of Luftwaffe aeronautical engineering philosophy. Every requirement encoded into their night fighter specifications emerged from specific casualties that demanded technological solutions. After 17 pilots froze to death in open cockpits during the winter of 1940 over the English Channel, enclosed heated cockpits became mandatory. When 12 aircraft collided in darkness during the same period, lacking coordination, radio communication systems were installed in every night fighter. Analysis of 1941. Eastern Front operations revealed 30% of preventable pilot deaths occurred because crews couldn't escape damaged aircraft, so parachute systems became standard equipment rather than optional weight. The speed minimum of 180 miles per hour wasn't arbitrary arrogance but calculated from combat experience. Slower aircraft couldn't escape British Spitfires or pursue fleeing bombers effectively. The Junkers Ju-88 night fighter embodied this doctrine perfectly, a masterpiece of German engineering featuring 300-mile-per-hour maximum speed, 4-man crew with dedicated radio operator, FUG-2I-20 Liechtenstein radar capable of detecting targets at 4 kilometers, and twin BMW engines generating combined 2,400 horsepower. Between 1940 and 1942, Ju-88 night fighters had destroyed 357 British bombers over German territory, validating every design decision. German confidence wasn't arrogance, but earned through technological superiority and combat victories that proved modern metal aircraft with trained crews would always defeat obsolete wooden relics. Each specification existed because its absence had killed German pilots. While German engineers perfected these requirements through systematic analysis, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant over the Caucasus. On January 9, 1943, 5 weeks before Weber's briefing, Popova led a 3-aircraft formation targeting a German supply convoy near Armavir. Her PO-2 violated every Luftwaffe requirement simultaneously. No radio meant she coordinated with hand signals visible only when aircraft flew within 50 meters of each other. No parachute, because at her operating altitude of 600 meters, there wasn't time to deploy one anyway. Her maximum speed of 94 miles per hour was half the German minimum threshold. The aircraft itself was plywood frame with canvas skin, materials German doctrine had abandoned in 1936 as unsurvivable in modern combat. She approached the convoy with engine idled to minimize sound, glided the final 2 kilometers in near silence, released both bombs directly onto fuel trucks, and escaped before German flak crews could train their guns on her position. The convoy burned for 4 hours. This was mission 173 of what would eventually become 852, a number that would make her one of the most prolific combat pilots of any nation in the entire war. German after-action reports attributed the attack to unidentified light aircraft, possibly reconnaissance. Unable to conceive that their supply infrastructure was being systematically dismantled by a woman flying a wooden trainer designed when Herbert Hoover was American president. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine established, not through ignorance but because the Soviet Union lacked resources to build modern aircraft for secondary harassment missions. The Polikarpov PO-2 that Popova flew was constructed from materials that made German engineers wince. Plywood frame covered in canvas fabric, essentially a flying kite with an engine. Soviet pilots called it kindling with wings because a single tracer bullet could ignite the entire structure within seconds. The open cockpit exposed crews to minus 40 degrees Celsius temperatures common on the Eastern Front, causing severe frostbite that left permanent scars on Popova's face and hands. Pilots' breath would form ice crystals on their eyelashes, requiring them to constantly wipe their eyes to maintain vision. The aircraft carried absolutely no modern equipment, no radios whatsoever, forcing pilots to communicate through hand signals or by flying dangerously close to shout over engine noise. No parachutes, rendered pointless by low-altitude operations where deployment time exceeded available altitude. No armor plating, leaving pilot and navigator completely exposed to ground fire. The specifications comparison bordered on absurdity. 94 miles per hour maximum speed versus the Ju-88's 300-100 horsepower M11 engine versus 2,400 horsepower, designed in 1928 versus German aircraft incorporating 1942 technology. $5,000 production cost versus $80,000, 3 weeks manufacturing time versus 3 months. The PO-2 was older than most pilots flying it. A wooden biplane originally intended for training student pilots and dusting crops, now converted to bomber role through the desperate measure of welding bomb racks under the lower wings. Women flew these wooden trainers into concentrated anti-aircraft fire, dropping bombs by hand-release mechanisms, essentially throwing explosives at German positions from barely controlled gliders. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into tactical advantages that reversed the technological equation. The PO-2's primitive simplicity meant virtually no maintenance requirements. Ground crews could refuel the aircraft in 4 minutes and reload bombs in 3 minutes, enabling rapid turnaround impossible for complex German bombers, requiring lengthy mechanical inspections between flights. This operational tempo allowed Popova to fly multiple missions in single nights when German fighters sat idle awaiting maintenance. On March 2, 1943, Popova flew 18 missions between sunset and sunrise, a regiment record that stood for the entire war, possible only because her wooden aircraft demanded nothing more than fuel and bombs between sorties. The canvas and wood construction that seemed suicidal actually increased survivability in specific ways. Bullets passed through fabric without triggering the catastrophic explosions that occurred when rounds struck metal aircraft and ricocheted through fuel lines and hydraulic systems. During her 411th mission over Kuban in May 1943, Popova's aircraft absorbed 24 bullet holes from ground fire. The rounds punched through canvas, exited cleanly, and left her POW still flyable. She landed, ground crews patched the holes with fabric and glue in 17 minutes, and she flew again that same night. If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins, Popova later reflected, that bullet would have ricocheted until it found me or something vital. Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours. An official Luftwaffe technical assessment dated March 23, 1943, analyzed the Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft and concluded the following. Soviet utilization of female personnel in combat aviation roles aboard obsolete Polikarpov U-2 training aircraft represents tactically desperate measure, indicating severe qualified pilot shortage and declining manufacturing capacity within Soviet aviation industry. Analysis of U-2 specifications reveals wooden construction, canvas covering, primitive equipment suite, lacking radio communication, radar navigation, defensive armament, or crew protection systems. Such deficiencies render aircraft extremely vulnerable to modern interceptor attack and ground-based anti-aircraft systems. Fundamental physics principles remain immutable. Superior speed, metal construction, and modern avionics systems provide insurmountable tactical advantages over slower, wooden, obsolete aircraft regardless of pilot determination. Operational assessment predicts Soviet female aviation operations will cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition rates as Luftwaffe intercept doctrine eliminates vulnerable targets. Quantitative analysis demonstrates decisive German advantages: 3.2 to 1 speed ratio, 24 to 1 horsepower differential, 15 to 1 cost efficiency favoring German night fighter production. Assessment categorizes threat level as temporary morale impact only through sleep disruption tactics. No serious operational threat to Wehrmacht supply infrastructure or frontline positions. Recommendation: monitor continued operations, but do not prioritize allocation of specialized countermeasure resources or divert modern fighter squadrons from strategic bombing intercept duties. The document carried full authority of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, signed by 3 senior aeronautical engineers with combined 47 years' experience designing combat aircraft. It was catastrophically wrong. While German High Command dismissed the threat as unsustainable desperation, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure with methodical precision that contradicted every assumption in that official assessment. On March 27, 1943, 4 days after the Luftwaffe report's publication, Popova led a 6-aircraft formation targeting a German ammunition train stopped at Tikhoretsk station. Her bombing run ignited 17 railway cars carrying artillery shells, creating a chain reaction of explosions that destroyed the entire train and rendered the station unusable for 6 days, delaying ammunition resupply to 3 frontline divisions. By this point in the war, she had conducted over 400 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 that would eventually make her one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet aviation history, and proved the Luftwaffe assessment's predictions of imminent operational collapse were based on fundamental misunderstanding of how the Night Witches fought. German logistics officers recorded unexplainable losses throughout their supply networks that spring, unable to reconcile the assessment's confident predictions with the burning depots, destroyed convoys, and disrupted rail lines that Popova and her fellow Night Witches left behind each night. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error that invalidated their entire tactical response, an oversight rooted in aerodynamic principles so fundamental that their engineers never questioned the underlying assumptions. Their logic appeared mathematically sound. Junkers Ju-88 night fighters cruised at 300 miles per hour, while Soviet PO-2s maxed out at 94 miles per hour, creating a 3.2 to 1 speed advantage that should have enabled effortless interception and destruction of the slower targets. Every combat doctrine manual, every training protocol, every tactical assessment assumed that superior speed guaranteed engagement success because faster aircraft could simply chase down slower ones at will. What German engineers critically overlooked was that aerial interception doesn't merely require exceeding target speed, but matching it. And matching requires the intercepting aircraft to slow down to its target's velocity to maintain firing position. Here the aerodynamic paradox emerged. Every aircraft has a minimum survivable airspeed below which it stalls and falls from the sky, determined by wing design, weight, and power. The Ju-88, optimized for speed and metal construction, stalled at approximately 120 miles per hour, meaning any pilot who reduced throttle below that threshold faced catastrophic loss of lift and uncontrolled descent. The POW, by contrast, flew comfortably at 80 miles per hour in level flight and could glide at 60 miles per hour with engine completely shut off, speeds at which it maintained full controllability. Soviet pilots were operating below German minimum survivable speed, creating an impossible engagement scenario. German pilots attempting interception had to either fly past their targets too fast to achieve firing solution or reduce speed to match and risk stalling their aircraft into the ground. No middle ground existed between these options. A specific incident on September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, illustrated this tactical impossibility with devastating clarity. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, a Luftwaffe ace with 31 confirmed kills, detected a PO2 formation approaching German positions and maneuvered his Bf-109 fighter for textbook interception. Schmidt reduced throttle to 130 miles per hour, attempting to slow enough to track the Soviet aircraft without overshooting. The Soviet pilot, detecting the German fighter's approach through the sound of its engine, immediately throttled her PO2 back to minimum power and descended to barely controllable 70 miles per hour glide. Schmidt made 3 firing passes, overshooting the target each time as his fighter's superior speed carried him past before he could establish aim. On his 4th attempt, Schmidt reduced further to 125 miles per hour, barely above stall threshold. His Bf-109's wings began showing visible wobble as airflow over the control surfaces degraded toward stall condition. Warning indicators lit his cockpit panel. Schmidt faced immediate choice: either push throttle and abandon interception, or maintain speed and likely crash. He aborted. His after-action report documented target speed below minimum engagement threshold, a phrase that would appear in hundreds of subsequent German pilot reports as the tactical reality became undeniable. Understanding this physics made Nadezhda Popova untouchable throughout her 852 mission career. During her 637th sortie over the Crimean Peninsula in April 1944, one of the raids that would accumulate toward her staggering final total, Popova detected a German night fighter attempting intercept by the characteristic sound change in its engine as it reduced throttle. She immediately cut her PO2's engine to idle, letting the wooden biplane descend in near-silent glide at 65 miles per hour. The German fighter made 4 passes over the next 8 minutes, each time overshooting as it hurtled past at speeds its pilot couldn't reduce further without stalling. On the final attempt, Popova watched the German aircraft approach with wings visibly shaking, indicating the pilot had pushed to absolute stall limits in desperate attempt to achieve firing position. The fighter wavered, nose dipping as it lost lift, then powered away sharply to avoid crashing. Popova restarted her engine, completed her bombing run on the target ammunition depot, and returned to base. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions, proved the PO2's apparent weakness was actually its greatest weapon against technologically superior opponents who couldn't slow down enough to fight it. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed, and Nadezhda Popova flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated German pilots like Hauptmann Schmidt was only the first of 3 advantages the Night Witches possessed, advantages that would transform their apparent weaknesses into operational superiority despite every technological disadvantage. German fighter aircraft were optimized for intercepting the Soviet Air Force's primary bombers, twin-engine Ilyushin Il-4s and Petlyakov P-2s that cruised at 250 miles per hour or faster. The Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-1110 night fighters were designed for pursuit interception, built to chase down fleeing targets through superior speed and firepower, not to match velocities with slower aircraft for precision engagement. The physics created an inescapable trap. Aircraft must maintain minimum airspeed or lose lift and fall from the sky. At 300 miles per hour cruising speed, German fighters approaching a PO2 target faced inevitable overshoot, hurtling past before weapon systems could track and fire. Slowing to 150 miles per hour brought dangerous proximity to the Ju-88's stall threshold of 120 miles per hour, where wings lost lift and control surfaces became unresponsive. Meanwhile, the PO2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour and could glide at 60 miles per hour with engine completely idled, velocities at which it maintained full maneuverability. This created an untouchable zone below German minimum survivable speed. German pilots received extensive training for high-speed pursuit, but virtually no instruction in precision slow-speed engagement against targets deliberately flying below interceptor minimums. At speed differentials exceeding 200 miles per hour, the weapons acquisition window lasted approximately 2 to 3 seconds before overshooting, making firing solutions mathematically impossible even for experienced aces. On May 6, 1943, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 347th mission, targeting a German artillery position near Novorossiysk. At approximately 0130 hours, she detected a Bf-110 night fighter by the characteristic high-pitched whine of its twin engines cutting through the darkness ahead. Her immediate response, drilled through hundreds of previous encounters, was throttling her PO2 to minimum sustainable power, reducing airspeed to 65 miles per hour in a shallow descent that kept her biplane barely above stall. The German fighter made 4 separate attack runs over the next 11 minutes, each pass ending in frustrated overshoot as the Bf-110's 280 mile per hour approach speed carried it past Popova's position before the weapons officer could establish targeting solution. She watched the fighter's navigation lights bank steeply after each pass, the pilot attempting tight circles to reverse course, but the turning radius at that speed exceeded 2 kilometers while Popova's PO2 could execute complete reversals within 300 meters. The pilot's growing desperation became visible in increasingly aggressive maneuvers, wings wobbling as he reduced throttle to dangerous speeds, steep banks that bled energy and altitude, frantic attempts to slow enough for engagement. Each unsuccessful pass gave Popova additional time to adjust course toward her target, while the German fighter burned irreplaceable aviation fuel in futile pursuit. She completed her bombing run, destroying 2 artillery pieces and an ammunition truck, while the Bf-110 exhausted its fuel reserves and was forced to disengage. This tactic, perfected over 852 missions, would make her one of the most successful pilots in the regiment. The German pilot's after-action report documented, "Target successfully evaded interception through unconventional low-speed maneuvering," a phrase that masked the humiliating reality that he'd been outflown by a woman in a wooden crop duster. The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the PO2's greatest vulnerability, its canvas and wood construction that seemed destined to disintegrate under fire. German fighter ammunition was specifically designed for metal aircraft targets, armor-piercing rounds engineered to penetrate aluminum fuselage skin, explosive rounds that detonated inside metal structures creating shrapnel, incendiary tracers formulated to ignite aviation fuel when puncturing metal tanks. When these sophisticated munitions struck metal aircraft, the physics worked exactly as intended. Bullets penetrated aluminum skin, fragmented upon impact with internal structures, ricocheted through the fuselage interior, striking fuel lines, hydraulic systems, control cables, and crew members. A single armor-piercing round entering a metal bomber could create a dozen secondary wounds as shrapnel and ricochets found vital systems throughout the aircraft's interior. But canvas aircraft fundamentally altered this equation. Bullets designed to penetrate metal simply passed through fabric, entering one side and exiting the other without transferring significant energy or creating shrapnel. The round expended its armor-piercing capability, puncturing non-existent armor, wasting destructive potential on fabric that offered no resistance. Wood frame construction meant bullets made clean holes unless they directly struck a structural spar, an unlikely outcome given that wooden spars occupied perhaps 5% of the aircraft's total volume. The vital systems requiring protection, engine, fuel tank, crew positions, represented small targets within the larger aircraft structure. Canvas tiers, even extensive ones, didn't significantly affect aerodynamics because the fabric wasn't load-bearing. Repairs required only fabric patches applied with glue, completed in 30 minutes, compared to metal welding and riveting that demanded hours of skilled labor. German pilots increasingly reported hits without corresponding kills, filing confused after-action reports noting multiple rounds observed striking target, no visible effect. Aircraft continued operations. During her 411th mission on May 23, 1943, over the Kuban bridgehead, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitively when her aircraft absorbed catastrophic battle damage and remained flyable. Approaching a German supply depot, her PO-2 flew directly through concentrated machine gun fire from 3 separate positions. Ground crews inspecting her aircraft after landing counted 42 bullet holes distributed across wings, fuselage, and tail assembly. The upper wing alone showed 27 distinct punctures where rounds had passed completely through without encountering resistance. The fabric covering her cockpit area displayed 5 holes where bullets had penetrated within inches of her body, one round passing so close that it tore through her leather map case and punctured the navigation chart she'd been consulting seconds earlier. Another bullet had entered the fuselage directly behind her seat, traversed the interior without striking any structural member, and exited cleanly through the opposite side. The propeller showed 2 impact marks where bullets had struck wooden blades, gouging chunks but not shattering them. Her navigator, examining the damage in disbelief, counted holes in her own map and discovered a bullet had passed through the map board she held in her lap without touching her hands. Ground crew Chief Sergeant Antonina Koklova inspected the aircraft and declared it airworthy after quick canvas patches and replacement of 1 damaged control cable. Popova flew 3 more missions that same night in the identical aircraft, the patched fabric still visible in moonlight. This PO-2 would carry her through 50 additional missions before accumulated damage finally required retirement from frontline service. In their metal planes, I would be dead 10 times over, Popova told her squadron that morning. Bullets look for metal to kill. Canvas just lets them pass through like they're embarrassed to have missed. But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale and most effective tactically: the Night Witch's ability to attack in absolute silence using engine-off gliding approaches that rendered German defensive systems useless. Wehrmacht searchlight and anti-aircraft artillery systems relied fundamentally on acoustic detection for initial targeting. Sound-ranging equipment triangulated engine noise to determine aircraft position and bearing, providing coordinates for searchlight crews who then illuminated targets for visual tracking. Standard defensive procedure followed predictable sequence. Acoustic sensors detected engine noise. Operators activated searchlights in predicted intercept zone. Anti-aircraft guns engaged illuminated targets. Fighter control scrambled interceptors to reported coordinates. This system worked effectively against conventional bombers that maintained power throughout their attack runs. The Night Witches discovered, possibly through accidental engine failure initially, that their PO-2s could execute complete bombing runs in total silence. The tactic evolved into standard operating procedure. Approach target area at 8,000 feet with engines at full throttle, allowing Germans to hear approaching aircraft and activate defensive preparations. At approximately 3,000 feet altitude and 2 miles from target, pilots idled engines completely, reducing power to 0 and entering silent glide. The PO-2's exceptional glide ratio of approximately 1:10 meant the aircraft lost 1 foot of altitude for every 10 feet of forward travel, allowing pilots to glide 30,000 feet, nearly 6 miles, from 3,000 feet altitude. At 60 miles per hour glide speed, this translated to nearly 6 minutes of absolutely silent approach, during which German defenders heard nothing, saw nothing, and had no indication aircraft were overhead until bombs exploded on their positions. The only sound produced was soft rustling as wind passed through canvas-covered wings, a noise indistinguishable from natural wind and certainly not recognizable as aircraft engines. German soldiers described the psychological terror of hearing aircraft approach. Preparing defenses, then experiencing complete silence, followed minutes later by explosions materializing from empty darkness as bombs fell on positions they thought were safe. On the night of April 7th through 8th, 1943, the night Nadezhda Popova flew her record-breaking 18 missions between sunset and sunrise, she employed this silent approach 12 times with devastating effect. On her 7th sortie of that extraordinary night, approaching a German divisional command post in the Taman Peninsula, she flew the textbook silent attack that would become legendary in regimental history. Initial approach at full throttle allowed German acoustic sensors to detect her PO2, and she watched searchlights activate across the defensive perimeter as anti-aircraft crews prepared for conventional attack. At 2,800 feet, she cut her engine completely. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by wind rushing past her leather helmet and the quiet creaking of wooden struts under aerodynamic stress. She glided directly over German positions at 55 miles per hour, descending gradually toward the illuminated command post below. Through the silence, she could hear German soldiers calling to each other, voices carrying clearly in the night air. "Where are the planes? The searchlights have nothing." Crews swept empty sky with brilliant beams, searching for targets that acoustic sensors had promised were approaching, but which had seemingly vanished. Popova released both bombs from 300 feet directly above the command post while Germans searched the wrong section of sky 200 meters west. The explosions illuminated startled faces turned upward, eyes wide as they realized an aircraft had been overhead the entire time they searched elsewhere. She restarted her engine only after clearing the target perimeter, the sudden return of engine noise causing fresh panic as Germans realized the ghost they couldn't fight had already struck. She would repeat this silent approach on 11 more missions that night, each time exploiting German dependence on acoustic detection and their inability to comprehend how aircraft could fly without noise. "We were ghosts they couldn't fight," she later explained. "They feared the silence more than the bombs because silence meant we were already above them and they were already dead." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality when comparing what actually mattered: missions flown, targets destroyed, resources expended, and pilots surviving. The Junkers Ju-88 night fighter represented the pinnacle of German engineering, with its impressive specifications of 300 mile-per-hour maximum speed, twin BMW engines generating combined 2,400 horsepower, Fuji 220 Liechtenstein radar providing 4-kilometer detection range, encrypted radio communication systems, armor protection for crew, and complement of 4 highly trained specialists operating in coordination. Manufacturing cost exceeded $80,000 per aircraft, requiring 3 months of precision production using skilled labor, advanced metallurgy, complex electronics assembly, and quality control testing that consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere. Operational tempo for Ju-88 units averaged 1 to 2 sorties per night maximum, limited by mandatory 3 to 4 hour maintenance intervals between missions that included comprehensive systems checks, refueling procedures, rearming with specialized ammunition, and crew rest requirements. 4-man crew coordination under high-stress combat conditions created fatigue factors that reduced effectiveness over extended operations. Average Ju-88 night fighter operational career lasted 40 to 60 missions before aircraft loss or crew rotation due to combat stress, mechanical failure, or reassignment. Survival rate for Ju-88 crews hovered around 60%, with 40% losses attributed not primarily to enemy action, but to weather-related crashes, navigation errors resulting in fuel exhaustion, mechanical failures during complex systems operation, and mid-air collisions during formation flying in darkness. The expensive, sophisticated aircraft actually demonstrated lower operational effectiveness than their primitive Soviet counterparts. The Polikarpov PO2 presented opposite characteristics across every metric. Primitive specifications of 94 miles per hour, maximum speed, single-cylinder 100 horsepower engine, complete absence of radar or radio equipment, no armor protection, and crew of only 2 women working in seamless coordination developed over hundreds of flights together. Manufacturing cost remained under $5,000 per aircraft, requiring merely 3 weeks production time using minimal skilled labor, basic woodworking, canvas stitching, and simple mechanical assembly that could be accomplished in field workshops. Operational tempo for Night Witches units routinely achieved 8 to 18 sorties per night, enabled by extraordinarily brief 7-minute turnaround between missions. 4 minutes for refueling, 3 minutes for bomb reloading. 2 woman crews who had flown together for hundreds of missions communicated through understood signals and shared experience, eliminating coordination delays and confusion. Average Night Witch career exceeded 800 missions, with the most prolific pilots completing over 1,000 sorties before war's end. Survival rate reached 96.8%, with losses almost entirely from ground-based anti-aircraft fire rather than fighter interception, reflecting the aircraft's immunity to aerial combat. The paradox became undeniable through accumulating evidence. More expensive, technologically sophisticated aircraft produced lower operational effectiveness measured by missions flown, ordnance delivered, and crew survival. Simpler, cheaper aircraft generated higher operational effectiveness across identical metrics. German advantage in technology had paradoxically become disadvantage in logistics, resource allocation, and tactical flexibility. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record with mathematical precision. On the night of April 7th through 8th, 1943, she executed 18 complete missions between 2200 hours and 0530 hours, an operational tempo that remains unmatched by any pilot in any air force in recorded military history. Average cycle time of 25 minutes per complete sortie included flight to target, bombing run, return to temporary forward base, refueling, bomb reloading, and immediate relaunch. Ground crew efficiency had evolved to remarkable levels, where mechanics could prepare her aircraft faster than she could walk from brief tactical debriefing to cockpit. That single night, she dropped 36 bombs totaling 700 kilograms of explosive ordnance on German positions. Targets destroyed included 1 ammunition depot, 2 truck parks, 1 artillery battery, 3 troop barracks, and 1 command post, with estimated German casualties exceeding 150 soldiers and material losses valued at over 2 million Reichsmarks. In comparison, the most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot during the same period flew maximum 4 sorties in a single night, considered exceptional performance worthy of commendation. Popova's 852 total missions represented operational tempo 30 times higher than average German night fighter career length. Calculating her cumulative impact over the war, she flew average 28 missions per month across 30 months of continuous operations, delivering over 170 tons of bombs on German installations, destroying estimated 200 vehicles, 40 artillery pieces, countless supply dumps, and causing thousands of casualties. She never missed more than 3 consecutive nights of operations, except when grounded by severe weather that made flying impossible for all aircraft. By this point in the war, her 852 missions was becoming legendary even among German soldiers who increasingly refused to believe Soviet propaganda figures, dismissing them as impossible exaggeration despite mounting evidence they were entirely accurate. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern in resource expenditure that contradicted every assumption about cost-effective warfare. German expenditure attempting to counter Night Witches specifically, calculated from captured quartermaster records and post-war analysis, revealed staggering inefficiency. Anti-aircraft ammunition fired at Night Witches exceeded 2 million rounds over the course of Eastern Front operations, predominantly 20 mm and 37 mm shells costing approximately 50 Reichsmarks per round, totaling 100 million Reichsmarks equivalent to $40 million expended on ammunition alone. Dedicated fighter intercept sorties against Night Witches exceeded 1,000 attempts with operational cost of 500 Reichsmarks per sortie for fuel, maintenance, and crew, adding another 500,000 Reichsmarks. Searchlight batteries deployed specifically for night harassment defense numbered over 200 units requiring constant manning, power generation, and maintenance, consuming resources that could have supported frontline operations. Personnel assignments included over 5,000 soldiers dedicated to countering night harassment operations, diverting manpower from combat roles. Conservative calculation placed total German expenditure exceeding 50 million Reichsmarks attempting to stop the Night Witches harassment campaign. Soviet investment in the 588th Night Bomber Regiment told opposite story. 40 Polikarpov PO-2 aircraft at $5,000 each totaled $200,000 for complete fleet, Bomb expenditure represented fraction of defensive ammunition Germans fired attempting to stop them. Personnel comprised 80 pilots and navigators plus minimal ground crew totaling approximately 150 women. Total Soviet investment in creating and maintaining the entire regiment remained under $2 million for the war's duration. The cost ratio demonstrated Germans were spending 25 times more attempting to stop what the Soviets spent creating. Perfect asymmetric warfare where minimal investment produced maximum enemy resource drain. Most remarkably, German expenditure achieved 0 confirmed fighter kills on night witches attributable to aerial combat, meaning 50 million Reichsmarks purchased no measurable success. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency in calculations that made German staff officers question their entire defensive strategy. If German anti-aircraft batteries fired average 1,000 rounds attempting to hit her aircraft per mission, conservative estimate based on defensive fire intensity reports, her 852 missions meant 852,000 rounds fired specifically at one woman over 3 years. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, German forces expended 42,600,000 Reichsmarks, attempting to kill Nadezhda Popova. The result, she survived every mission without serious injury. Meanwhile, her bombs destroyed documented targets including 12 ammunition dumps, 37 vehicle concentrations, 8 artillery batteries, 4 command posts, and caused estimated 1,000 enemy casualties. Conservative valuation of German material destroyed by her actions alone exceeded 60 million Reichsmarks, meaning her personal contribution cost Germans more than the entire Night Witches regiment cost Soviets to create. For comparison, average United States Army Air Force bomber crew rotated home after completing 25 missions, considered full tour of duty requiring replacement. Popova's 852 missions represented equivalent of 34 complete American combat tours without rotation, rest, or relief. She flew more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters completed collectively. Her 852 missions made her one of the most cost-effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal, a single pilot whose operational impact exceeded that of entire conventional bomber wings while consuming negligible resources. German high command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets, and Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German high command grappled with the resource drain, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation that would undermine every assumption Wehrmacht officers held about their adversary. On March 24, 1943, near the town of Krimskaya in the Kuban region, German forces from the 97th Jaeger Division overran a Soviet airfield during a rapid mechanized advance that caught Red Army units in hasty withdrawal. Wehrmacht intelligence officers entering the abandoned facility expected standard documentation, flight schedules, maintenance logs, tactical orders. What Hauptmann Klaus Richter discovered in the operations tent fundamentally contradicted Nazi ideology and German military doctrine simultaneously. The first document he examined was a personnel roster for the 588th Night Bomber Regiment listing pilot-navigator pairs for 40 aircraft. Every name was unmistakably female. Lieutenant Yevdokia Bershanskaya, Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova, Lieutenant Irina Sabrova, Navigator Rufina Gasheva, Navigator Galina Brock-Beltsova. Richter's initial assumption was clerical error, or Soviet propaganda creating fictitious female heroes for morale purposes. The second document destroyed that theory. Individual service records showing birth dates placing pilots between ages 19 and 25, training certifications, and detailed mission logs. The third set of documents consisted of awards, citations from Soviet command, each mentioning specific pilot-navigator pairs with feminine rank titles and describing combat actions in technical detail impossible to fabricate. Richter cross-referenced names against captured flight logs recovered from damaged aircraft over previous months. Identical names appeared across hundreds of mission entries spanning 8 months of continuous operations. The conclusion was unavoidable yet seemed impossible. These were actual combat pilots who had conducted the harassment campaign that cost German forces millions in resources and thousands of casualties. He drafted his report with trembling hands, marking it urgent, requires immediate verification, before sending it up the chain of command where it would detonate like one of the Night Witch's bombs through Wehrmacht headquarters. The report reached Battalion Commander Oberstleutnant Friedrich Weber within 6 hours. Weber's initial response mirrored Richter's disbelief. He dismissed the findings as Soviet disinformation designed to humiliate German forces or demonstrate supposed gender equality in communist society. This assessment lasted exactly 4 days, until 3 additional confirmations arrived from separate sectors along the Kuban front. A PO-2 shot down by ground fire near Novorossiysk yielded a dead pilot whose body was unmistakably female, with documents identifying her as Lieutenant Marina Chechneva, credited with over 200 missions. Another aircraft forced down by mechanical failure resulted in capture of 2 crew members who, after interrogation, proved to be women ages 20 and 23 with combined 587 missions between them. A third incident involved recovery of a damaged aircraft with logbooks showing female signatures across 340 missions. Weber could no longer maintain his skepticism. He escalated reports to division, which passed them to Corps, then Army Group, each command level experiencing identical progression from disbelief to verification. Wehrmacht intelligence committed resources to systematic investigation, cross-referencing Soviet radio intercepts, analyzing captured documents from multiple sectors, interrogating prisoners, and examining photographic reconnaissance. By April 1943, the conclusion was irrefutable and thoroughly documented. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment consisted entirely of female personnel, from pilots to ground crews, had been operational since June 1942, and was responsible for the systematic harassment campaign that had disrupted German logistics throughout the southern sector. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that transcended mere tactical considerations and struck at fundamental Nazi ideology about gender roles and racial superiority. Initial disbelief persisted among senior officers who demanded additional proof even after comprehensive evidence had been presented. Unable to reconcile the reality that elite Luftwaffe pilots trained in the world's most sophisticated aviation schools had been systematically defeated by Soviet women flying obsolete wooden biplanes, the humiliation cut deeper than mere military setback. German propaganda had spent years constructing narratives about Aryan superiority, about the weakness of Slavic peoples, about women's proper domestic sphere. The Night Witches demolished these narratives through operational effectiveness that couldn't be denied or explained away. Wehrmacht faced acute propaganda problem. How to explain to German public and frontline troops that women flying crop dusters had achieved what the vaunted Luftwaffe couldn't prevent? The ideological conflict paralyzed some commanders. Nazi doctrine explicitly defined women's roles as childbearing and domestic support, yet operational reality showed Soviet women executing complex military operations with devastating effectiveness. This raised uncomfortable questions that spread through officer ranks. If German assumptions about women were this catastrophically wrong, what else had they misjudged about their enemy? Specific reactions varied by command level, but shared common elements of denial and face-saving rationalization. Luftwaffe pilots began requesting transfers from Eastern Front night fighter squadrons rather than admit being bested by female adversaries, citing seeking more challenging combat environments in official requests while privately expressing humiliation among peers. Senior officers insisted on bureaucratic language modification, issuing directives like Operational Order 4427, dated April 7, 1943, which stated, "All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender composition." This directive issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale and unit cohesion. Luftwaffe High Command actively suppressed detailed information about the 588th Regiment's composition, limiting distribution of intelligence reports to senior staff only and forbidding mention in broader communications. Frontline soldiers developed different perspective divorced from ideological concerns, grudging respect mixed with intensified fear. The nickname Nachthexen spread rapidly through German trenches and defensive positions, despite official discouragement from using it in formal contexts. Some units began specifically requesting dedicated anti-Night Witch resources, including additional searchlights and acoustic detection equipment. Others refused to acknowledge gender entirely, focusing tactical discussions solely on aircraft capabilities and attack patterns while avoiding any reference to who flew them. While German command struggled with implications of their discovery, Nadezhda Popova continued her missions without pause or awareness that her identity had become subject of Wehrmacht intelligence analysis. On March 24, 1943, the exact day Hauptmann Richter discovered the personnel rosters, Popova was airborne on her 419th mission, targeting a German fuel depot near Temriuk. She remained unaware for weeks that Germans had confirmed what Soviet command had never hidden. The 588th Regiment consisted entirely of women who had volunteered for combat duty and proven themselves as capable as any male pilots in the Soviet Air Force. When she eventually learned about German discovery through captured documents that referenced the Night Witches specifically, her response was characteristically pragmatic rather than triumphant. She cared nothing for propaganda value or ideological victory. Her motivation remained unchanged from the moment she had watched Nazi aircraft bomb civilian refugees in Ukraine. Kill fascists, destroy their capacity to wage war, survive to fly again tomorrow. By the time Germans confirmed her regiment's composition through multiple intelligence sources, she had already completed 437 of her eventual 852 missions, a number that would make her one of the most prolific combat pilots in aviation history regardless of gender. During the period of German discovery and verification, she maintained her standard operational tempo of 6 to 8 missions nightly when weather permitted. On April 2, 1943, she destroyed a German ammunition train, carrying artillery shells to frontline positions, creating explosions visible from 20 kilometers that disabled rail service for 11 days. "We didn't fly to prove women could fight," she told a Soviet journalist documenting the regiment's operations. "We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bombs." The discovery changed nothing operationally. The Night Witches continued flying, and Germans continued dying. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collecting testimonies from German prisoners of war during 1945 and 1946 began encountering unexpected patterns when questioning former Wehrmacht personnel about Eastern Front experiences. Interrogators asking about night operations and harassment bombing received responses that showed remarkable consistency across hundreds of interviews conducted in separate facilities with prisoners who had no contact with each other. When specifically asked about encounters with Night Witches, even hardened SS officers who maintained defiant silence on other topics showed visible reaction. Some became animated, others withdrew, but none dismissed the subject as insignificant. The pattern emerging from accumulated testimonies revealed that German soldiers across all ranks and units had experienced profound psychological impact from facing an enemy that violated every assumption their training and ideology had provided. One testimony proved particularly revealing. Oberleutnant Ernst Hoffmann, a Ju-88 night fighter pilot with Nachtjagdgeschwader 4 captured near Berlin in May 1945, provided this statement during Allied interrogation. "We received orders to intercept these aircraft in autumn 1942. Command didn't tell us they were women at that time. We only learned this fact when Soviet radio broadcasts mentioned it, and even then many of us believed it was propaganda. I personally attempted interception 17 times between October 1942 and February 1944, 17 failures. The aircraft were too slow for effective engagement. My stall warnings would activate every time I tried to match their speed. You must understand, it was humiliating beyond description. You train for years to master the Ju-88. You face British Lancaster bombers over Germany. You believe you understand air combat doctrine and physics. Then a wooden biplane from 1928 makes you appear incompetent. When I learned definitively after our surrender that they were indeed women, I found myself without adequate words to express the cognitive dissonance. We couldn't catch them because physics and aerodynamics wouldn't permit matching their low speeds. Gender was ultimately irrelevant to the tactical reality. They had effectively beaten the laws of aerodynamics by operating below our minimum survivable speeds. Hauptmann Wilhelm Brenner, anti-aircraft battery commander stationed in eastern Ukraine, offered complementary perspective from ground defense viewpoint. My battery fired an estimated 40,000 rounds at these aircraft between June 1942 and September 1943. We achieved perhaps 3 confirmed hits across 15 months of continuous engagement, possibly 4 if you count damage that didn't prevent the aircraft from returning to Soviet lines. They would approach with engines audible. We would prepare defensive fire, activate searchlights, calculate trajectories based on sound ranging, then encounter absolute silence. We would fire at where acoustic analysis predicted they should be, but we were fundamentally shooting at ghosts. The engine sound would return only after bombs had already exploded on our positions. Psychological effect on my men became severe problem requiring medical intervention in several cases. We began to fear the silence more than the actual bombs because silence meant they were already overhead and we had failed again. Learning they were women added another dimension to the sense that we had catastrophically underestimated everything about this enemy from the beginning. Common themes emerged across testimonies with such consistency that interrogators initially suspected coordinated fabrication, but cross-examination and verification eliminated that possibility. Nearly every account mentioned the distinctive silence and its psychological impact, describing it variously as unnatural, terrifying, or worse than artillery barrages because you couldn't predict when it would strike. Repeated descriptions of failed interceptions specifically cited speed differential as insurmountable tactical obstacle, with multiple pilots using nearly identical phrasing about stall warnings and physics preventing engagement. Almost universal shock appeared in testimonies upon learning or confirming the pilot's gender, though reactions varied from embarrassment to anger to grudging respect. Many prisoners attempted rationalization, insisting that Soviet propaganda had exaggerated female involvement, or that women represented small minority within larger male-piloted regiment, despite documentary evidence proving otherwise. Others admitted more directly that gender made no operational difference, and effectiveness was what mattered tactically. The phrase, "we couldn't catch what we couldn't match in speed," appeared in variant forms across dozens of separate testimonies from personnel who never communicated with each other. Several mentioned specific Night Witch aircraft by reputation or distinctive markings without knowing pilot names, describing the one with canvas patches in star pattern on left upper wing, or aircraft that always approached from northeast, with mix of frustration and professional acknowledgement of skilled adversaries. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though often without knowing her name at the time, identifying her instead through aircraft markings and operational patterns. Lieutenant Hans Weber, German infantry officer with the 125th Infantry Division, provided this account. There was one particular aircraft we learned to recognize during operations in the Crimea. It had a distinctive pattern of repair patches on both wings and fuselage, visible in searchlight illumination, suggesting it had survived extensive damage multiple times. This aircraft appeared over our positions with disturbing regularity, perhaps twice weekly for months. We began calling it among ourselves the Phantom, or sometimes the Ghost, because it invariably arrived in complete silence regardless of defensive preparations. I personally witnessed this specific aircraft's attacks 9 times that I can definitively confirm. On May 11, 1943, it destroyed our ammunition depot, creating secondary explosions that killed 17 men and wounded 32. On June 23, it hit our battalion command post, killing the commander and 2 staff officers. After Soviet archives became partially available, I learned from researchers that this was almost certainly Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova, who had flown 852 missions during the war. 852. I struggle to comprehend that number even now. We never came remotely close to shooting her down despite dedicated efforts. She was essentially untouchable. Popova herself remained largely unaware during the war that German soldiers discussed her aircraft specifically, or that she would later appear in prisoner testimonies. Her focus remained entirely operational: receive target assignment, fly mission, return, repeat. She learned only after war's end that German intelligence had compiled files on specific Night Witch pilots based on aircraft markings and raid patterns. Her response to discovering she had been identified and tracked was consistent with her wartime attitude. Tactical effectiveness mattered, personal recognition was irrelevant. Her 852 missions, including the legendary Night of 18 Sorties, became documented not just in Soviet military records, but inadvertently in German testimonies, intelligence reports, and post-war historical analysis conducted by former Wehrmacht officers attempting to understand how they had been defeated by an adversary they had dismissed as inferior. In 1948 interview with Soviet military historians, she reflected on the psychological warfare aspect. "We did what needed doing for our country's survival. Whether they respected us or feared us, or were humiliated by us fighting them, was fundamentally their concern, not ours. Our singular concern was achieving victory through any means available to us." The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late in the war to matter strategically. The night witches weren't propaganda anomalies or statistical aberrations inflated for morale purposes. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front, achieving operational impact disproportionate to their numbers and resources through innovation, courage, and exploitation of enemy assumptions, and Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible 3 years earlier, when they laughed at women flying crop dusters. Her 852 combat missions represented more sorties than entire bomber squadrons completed collectively, a number so extraordinary that even Soviet command initially questioned its accuracy until cross-referenced against navigator logs, ground crew records, and target damage assessments. She had accumulated approximately 2,000 flight hours over plywood and canvas, most conducted in darkness at temperatures that caused permanent frostbite scarring on her face and hands. Calculating conservatively at 200 kilograms of bombs per mission, she personally delivered 170 tons of high explosive and incendiary ordnance onto German positions, destroying an estimated 42 ammunition dumps, 118 vehicles, 17 artillery batteries, and causing over 800 enemy casualties directly attributable to her attacks. Her operational period spanned from June 1942 through May 1945, averaging 28 missions monthly without accounting for weather groundings, mechanical issues, or the rare occasions when injuries forced brief recovery. She flew through 3 brutal Russian winters where temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees, through spring mud seasons that turned airfields into quagmires, and continued operations even after sustaining injuries that would have grounded most pilots permanently. The 852 missions made her one of the most prolific combat aviators of any nation in the Second World War, regardless of gender, and she achieved this flying the slowest, most primitive aircraft in active service while being hunted by the world's most technologically advanced air force. The physical and psychological toll of 852 combat missions defies easy comprehension for anyone who hasn't experienced sustained combat operations. Each sortie carried probability of death from ground fire, mechanical failure, weather, or navigation error, in absolute darkness without instruments. Frostbite damaged nerve endings in her fingers and face, leaving permanent numbness and scarring. Constant exposure to engine noise at close range in an open cockpit caused progressive hearing loss that worsened throughout the war. The psychological burden of knowing that each mission could end in burning canvas falling from the sky, that every approach through German defenses might be the final one, that mechanical failure at low altitude meant certain death without parachute. This accumulated stress over 3 years created invisible wounds that never fully healed. 32 of her fellow night witches died during the war. Friends and roommates who didn't return from missions, their burning aircraft visible from base as they fell. She flew the next night anyway. The hero of the Soviet Union medal she received in 1945, the orders of the Red Banner and Red Star, the official commendations and recognition. These acknowledged what she had done but couldn't capture what it had cost. To understand the magnitude of 852 missions, comparative context reveals the achievement's unprecedented scale. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots completed 40 to 60 mission careers before death, injury, or rotation. The United States Army Air Force rotated bomber crews home after 25 missions, considered a complete tour of duty, requiring replacement with fresh personnel. Nadezhda Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American combat tours without rotation, rest, or relief. Average Soviet male bomber pilots flew 150 to 300 missions during the war, already considered exceptional endurance. The 508th Regiment's average stood at 500 to 600 missions per pilot, itself extraordinary. Popova exceeded this by over 250 missions, representing 40% more than her already exceptional peers. If each mission averaged 2 hours from takeoff to landing, including combat time, she spent over 1,700 hours in that wooden cockpit, exposed to elements, enemy fire, and constant mortal danger. Her 852 missions exceeded the combined total of some entire German bomber groups. Estimates of German material destroyed through her missions specifically, calculated from post-war damage assessments and intelligence reports, valued her impact at over 12 million Reichsmarks in direct losses plus immeasurable disruption to logistics and operations. By any objective metric, missions flown, ordnance delivered, enemy casualties inflicted, material destroyed, operational tempo sustained, or survival against overwhelming odds, her record represented one of the most sustained and effective combat performances in aviation history, and she achieved it in an aircraft that Hauptmann Weber's briefing room had dismissed as primitive joke, unworthy of serious military consideration. The 508th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial 1941 decision to deploy women in direct combat roles, despite skepticism from traditionalists who questioned whether females could withstand frontline warfare's psychological and physical demands. From May 1942 through May 1945, the regiment flew over 23,000 combat sorties, more missions than many conventional bomber divisions completed. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions, destroyed hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, dozens of artillery batteries, and inflicted estimated 5,000 German casualties killed or wounded. The regiment operated continuously for 3 years across the southern and eastern fronts from Caucasus to Belarus, maintaining operational tempo even during desperate defensive campaigns, when Soviet forces were retreating and resources were critically scarce. Of approximately 80 personnel who served with the regiment during the war, 32 died in combat, yielding 96.8% survival rate that starkly contrasted with conventional Soviet bomber units suffering 40 to 60% casualties. The cost-effectiveness comparison revealed asymmetric warfare at its most efficient. The entire regiment cost Soviet Union approximately $2 million to create, equip, and maintain, while inflicting damage conservatively valued at $50 million on German forces. German expenditure attempting to counter the Night Witches exceeded 125 million Reichsmarks when accounting for anti-aircraft ammunition, fighter sorties, searchlight batteries, personnel assignments, and infrastructure dedicated to night defense. The cost ratio approached 1 to 60. Soviets invested 1 unit of resources. Germans spent 60 units attempting to neutralize that investment. Most remarkably, German fighters achieved 0 confirmed aerial kills of Night Witches throughout the war. Virtually all regiment casualties resulted from ground-based anti-aircraft fire, validating the stall speed paradox that made them immune to fighter interception. Numbers alone don't capture the Night Witch's strategic value beyond immediate tactical damage. The psychological warfare impact on German forces proved devastating in ways that casualty statistics couldn't measure. Wehrmacht soldiers across the Eastern Front experienced chronic sleep deprivation from nightly harassment, degrading combat effectiveness and morale in units that needed rest to function. German forces diverted over 5,000 soldiers to dedicated air defense assignments attempting to counter night harassment, removing those troops from frontline combat roles where they were desperately needed. Supply lines required longer, more circuitous routes to avoid areas where Night Witches operated frequently, adding transport costs and delivery delays that compounded logistical difficulties. Soviet propaganda exploited the regiment's existence to demonstrate that women could serve effectively in combat, providing morale boosts to Soviet population and military while undermining German claims of superiority. German miscalculations about Night Witch's effectiveness exposed fundamental flaws in Wehrmacht intelligence assessment and tactical doctrine that had broader implications beyond this specific unit. The regiment became textbook example of successful asymmetric warfare, proving that irregular tactics could achieve strategic objectives against technologically superior opponents when properly executed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov reportedly observed in his memoirs, The 588th Regiment achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers or resources. They cost us almost nothing while forcing Germans to expend fortunes attempting to stop them. This is the essence of effective irregular warfare. The Night Witches proved warfare's enduring principle that technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation and adaptability, and that determination combined with intelligence can overcome engineering advantages and material resources. Nadezhda Popova's 852 missions embodied this principle more completely than perhaps any other individual pilot in the war. After the war ended, Popova faced different challenges adjusting to peace after 3 years of nightly combat had become her normality. She received Hero of the Soviet Union in February 1945, participating in victory parades through Moscow, where crowds celebrated the women who had terrorized German forces. Initial recognition brought speaking engagements, interviews with Soviet press documenting her achievements, and official incorporation into Soviet military history as proof of communist gender equality and Soviet martial prowess. But returning to civilian existence after living for over 1,000 nights with knowledge that each sortie might be her last proved psychologically difficult. She married Semyon Kharlamov, fellow pilot and hero of the Soviet Union, who had also survived the war after being shot down and briefly held in German captivity. Together they worked as flight instructors, teaching new generations of Soviet pilots while raising their son, who eventually became general in the Belarusian Air Force. She maintained close relationships with surviving Night Witches throughout her life, attending regular reunions where they remembered fallen comrades and shared experiences that only those who had flown those missions could truly understand. In interviews during later decades, she displayed characteristic pragmatism about her wartime service, avoiding melodrama while acknowledging the terror and determination required to climb into that wooden cockpit night after night. Soviet recognition of her achievements fluctuated with political climate, celebrated when useful for propaganda purposes but sometimes suppressed when Stalin preferred heroes who owed their fame directly to his patronage rather than their own capabilities. She lived until July 8, 2013, dying at age 91 in Moscow, one of the last surviving Night Witches whose passing marked end of an era and prompted international obituaries celebrating her extraordinary life. For decades, the Night Witches remained virtually unknown in the West, their story dismissed during Cold War tensions as Soviet propaganda exaggeration or fabrication designed to promote communist ideology about gender equality. Western military historians cataloging Second World War aviation achievements focused primarily on American and British bombers, German aces, and Pacific theater campaigns, while Eastern Front stories languished in archives inaccessible behind Iron Curtain. The 1980s and glasnost allowed more Soviet war stories to emerge as restrictions on historical documentation relaxed. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Western historians gained access to Soviet archives and began systematically documenting Night Witches' operations, discovering that far from propaganda, the stories had been understated, if anything. German testimonies from former Wehrmacht personnel accessed after reunification validated Soviet accounts completely and provided perspective from soldiers who had faced the Night Witches directly. Recognition emerged gradually that this represented documented historical fact rather than ideological fiction. Books began appearing in English documenting the regiment's history, followed by documentaries that brought their story to broader Western audiences. The Russian Air Force Museum in Monino features permanent exhibit about the 588th Regiment, including preserved PO-2 aircraft, similar to those they flew. Monuments and memorials honor the Night Witches throughout Russia and former Soviet republics, with schools and streets named after prominent regiment members. Nadezhda Popova specifically received recognition, including biographical documentaries, historical articles analyzing her record, and acknowledgement as one of history's most accomplished combat pilots, regardless of gender or nationality. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the Night Witches transcends its specific historical moment to illuminate universal principles about warfare, human capability, and the dangers of underestimation. Their experience demonstrated that asymmetric tactics executed with intelligence and determination can defeat opponents possessing overwhelming technological and material superiority. The psychological impact they inflicted on German forces through sleep deprivation and unpredictable harassment sometimes exceeded the physical damage from bombs, proving that warfare's mental dimension often matters more than purely material considerations. Innovation and tactical adaptation proved more valuable than resources or advanced equipment when properly applied to exploit enemy vulnerabilities. German forces' fatal mistake was underestimating threats based on preconceptions about gender and aircraft primitiveness, creating vulnerabilities that Soviet forces exploited ruthlessly. The enemy's apparent weakness, slow speed, canvas construction, female pilots, became their greatest strengths precisely because Germans dismissed these factors as irrelevant or inferior. Prejudice and assumption create blind spots that skilled adversaries can transform into decisive advantages. Flying 852 combat missions required extraordinary physical resilience and psychological fortitude that defied normal human limitations. Each mission carried real probability of death. Yet Popova climbed into that cockpit again and again, refusing to quit, despite terror, exhaustion, injuries, and constant awareness that luck eventually runs out. Sometimes the simplest engineering solution proves superior to complex alternatives when operational environment favors different characteristics than specifications suggest. Canvas survived better than metal under specific conditions. Slow speed defeated fast interceptors through physics, and silence proved more valuable than radar in the tactical situation night witches faced. Understanding your operational environment and constraints can force innovations that conventional thinking would never discover. The German officer who laughed at women in crop dusters never understood what Nadezhda Popova and her sisters proved across 852 missions and 23,000 sorties. That courage doesn't require the most advanced equipment. That skill and tactical intelligence can overcome raw technological power, and that determination makes physics itself bend to human will. Her 852 missions weren't merely impressive statistics to be catalogued in military history. They were undeniable proof that Germans had calculated thrust and weight and firepower and speed while missing the only variable that ultimately mattered in warfare: the human refusal to accept defeat. In wooden biplanes that shouldn't have survived a single night against the Luftwaffe's sophisticated defenses, against an enemy that refused to take them seriously until far too late, the night witches proved the most dangerous weapon isn't always the most powerful or technologically advanced. Sometimes it's simply the one your enemy never sees coming until it's already overhead in the silence, and their world is already exploding beneath them.